My name is Don Linky. It is February 14, 2008, Valentine's Day. We're here on the campus of Rutgers University in New Brunswick at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. This is another in the series of interviews for the Brendan T. Byrne Archive being compiled by the Rutgers Program on the Governor. This afternoon we'll be speaking with Dr. Glenn Paulson, who's Associate Dean for Research at the School of Public Health of the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey and Rutgers University. Dr. Paulson held senior positions in the Department of Environmental Protection during the Byrne administration, and we'll be discussing with him today his role in some of the key environmental issues of the Byrne administration. Glenn, before we get into the specifics of the issues that you dealt with in the Byrne administration, why don't we start with some larger memories and thoughts about your time in state government working on environmental issues?
I think the main overall reaction that I have to that, besides it being one of the best jobs I ever had, was that prior to that I'd been a graduate student, citizen activist, an environmental activist in various ways, and trying to influence government decision-making on environmental and public health issues from the outside. This was a chance to be on the inside, to become one of the mythical decision-makers that I had been so long trying to influence in New York City and New York State, and to some extent nationally. It was going inside the door where analyses were made and decisions were taken, where power was actually exercised. It was an exciting time for me in a professional and a career sense, and I think it was an important time for the state of New Jersey as a whole, the Brendan Byrne years.
Well, let's get you back to the early days. Talk a bit about your upbringing, education, and how you got to Trenton finally during Brendan Byrne's administration.
I was born in northern Illinois, out in the cornfields, in a very small community, 5,000–6,000 people. Grew up through high school there, did pretty well, and was interested in the sciences, and then originally I thought I would become a physician. Not an unusual thought for somebody in high school who's good in the sciences. I then went to Northwestern University and majored in chemistry, and about halfway through I decided I was really more interested in the science side of things than I was in the medical side of things. So I gave up on the idea of going to medical school and instead targeted myself toward getting an advanced degree somewhere in the natural sciences. My interests were never totally narrow and disciplinary. So I had a major in chemistry, but a minor in biology, and another one in math, and another one in physics, kind of eclectic technical interests. And fortunately, I was pointed by a very senior professor in the chemistry department at Northwestern toward at that time, little known outside of the sciences graduate school, now called Rockefeller University in New York City, which was the only place at that time in the U.S., this is in the 60s, where you were forced to become multidisciplinary on your way to getting a PhD. That was a very attractive possibility to me, and I was pleased and honored when I got admitted. I took full advantage of the diverse education that was forced upon you if you were going to succeed. Ended up doing my PhD under René Dubos, a very well-known microbiologist and finally a significant figure in the environmental movement, who was himself a microbiologist by training, but I would say an ecologist at his core. And in addition to doing my PhD, which was on the long-term effects of low-level exposure to DDT in mice, he encouraged me to exercise what I guess I would call my social instincts by working after hours to educate citizens in New York City and New York State about the environmental aspects of problems that were already there, air pollution, water pollution, lead poisoning in slum kids among them, and potential problems, including chemical and biological warfare, the proposal to build a nuclear power plant on the banks of the East River in Queens, and similar things. He encouraged that extra involvement. DuBose himself became one of the first members of the board of directors of the Natural Resources Defense Council, which was the first public interest law firm founded immediately in the aftermath of Earth Day. And since I decided when I got my PhD I was really not cut out to continue the traditional postdoctoral fellowship and academic life, and had actually trained some of the young lawyers at NRDC on the science of air pollution, water pollution, and other things, I landed my first regular job after my PhD as the first staff scientist at that organization, and was doing that, I think, quite effectively, quite productively. I built a small scientific staff there to work with the lawyers, when out of the blue came a phone call from somebody named Tom Cecil, who was for a while the #2 person in the DEP in New Jersey shortly after Brendan was elected. I believe Tom was active in the first campaign, who said, "We have heard about you and we're looking for a top scientist for the DEP, and we would like to interview you." The phone call actually reached me when I was in Washington on business, so on the way home I got off the train in Trenton and was taken over to meet David Bardeen, Tom Cecil himself, other top officials of the department, and to make a long story short, a couple of months later I moved out of New York and down to Trenton and joined DEP as Assistant Commissioner for Science.
And do you recall what month that was that you came to Trenton full-time?
I believe it was in the fall of the first full year of Brendan's term. Fall
Which would have been
1974.
1974.
74. I think it was September, maybe August.
And as you move into the DEP, what did you see in terms of what they were up to, who the people were, and so forth?
Of course, the top leadership of the department had changed. The political appointees from the prior administration were by and large already gone, and new people had come in. The issue that was very much before the DEP, before the commissioner at that time, was resolving the Tox Island Dam issue. This was, as I understand it, not having been a resident of New Jersey until I moved here at that time, a significant issue in the prior campaign. The drive toward the Tox Island Dam had been going on for some couple of decades, maybe a bit longer, and it looked like it was going to be a fait accompli. It's very hard to stop the Corps of Engineers from doing something that it decides to do. But in his campaign, as I read the literature, Brendan said, "I need to be shown these years that the needs that led to the generation of the idea, which was a major flood after a hurricane some 20 years later, and other issues regarding recreational opportunities, that those original needs were still valid and could be met in no other way." He wanted a fresh look based on the current circumstances of the mid-1970s, not a judgment that was dating back to the 1950s. And he gave the DEP the responsibility to orchestrate that fresh look, with some pulling and hauling with the other involved states, notably New York and Pennsylvania. The governor orchestrated an appropriation from Congress to the Corps of Engineers to, with the full participation of the affected states, undertake a fresh look at the study.
Before we go too much further, why don't you give some background of the Tox Island proposal and its history to the point where you become involved in the decision making?
Okay. I already mentioned that there was a major hurricane and a flood, I think it was sometime in the late 50s, that caused widespread destruction and some loss of life along the main stem of the Delaware River, primarily affecting New Jersey, less so Pennsylvania, and as I recall, really no effects, significant effects in the upper reaches of the Delaware and New York State as well. In addition, there had been at least one, maybe two significant drought cycles in the river over the ensuing 20 years, which led to significant water shortages in major communities on both sides of the Delaware. There were no significant plans at the time that I came to DEP to develop new water supply sources in the state. And so these droughts, water rationing, and so on had been very much a political issue. And the Tox Island Dam originally proposed, as I read about it, for flood control purposes in the event of subsequent hurricanes, major rainstorms, and then also to provide a wet reservoir that could be the source of drinking water in times of drought. Those were the two main positive features of the Tox Island Dam. Tox Island is a small island, several tens of miles from the New York State border down the Delaware, which was a logical place. The river's relatively narrow, relatively deep. There's kind of a gorge in that location. A logical place where you could build a dam relatively short and back up a large amount of water for storage in flood circumstances and for water supply. That's where the name came from.
Of course, this issue was something that wasn't quite in keeping with your education and background as in your career to this point.
No, I had done a lot of work on water quality, water pollution, but not water quantity, floods and droughts. So this was an expansion of my knowledge. It led to my eclectic interests in things scientific and technical, of course. And it turns out the science and technology of thinking about water supply, flood control, and so on is not as difficult as some other things that I have dealt with scientifically in my past. Relatively easy. The politics of big water projects, however, are among the most complicated environmental issues that you can ever deal with.
Well, describe the various interests on each side of the issue in something as big as the Tox Island Dam proposal.
Well, there's usually more than two sides to a big water project. The communities that had been affected by flooding and their local leadership, and the memories were still quite fresh. You could actually still find high water marks on trees and physical structures from that flood of 20 years ago, if you knew where to look along the main stem of the Delaware. Those were very much in the minds of people that were still living, people that had lost homes, in some cases had lost loved ones. So that's one group. The communities that had suffered the droughts, including the industries that were heavy users of water from the Delaware for cooling and other purposes, were another constituency group. Sometimes they physically overlapped in the same areas. There was a small but vocal group that was interested in more recreational opportunities, particularly boating. The Delaware is good for canoeing and kayaking in its upper reaches. It's not good for power boating. And so there was an interest in that. To counterbalance that, there were fishing interests. The Delaware is a major river for the shad population of the entire eastern U.S. And if you build a dam, you're going to dramatically affect, if not wipe out, the shad run. And shad fishermen are among the most dedicated of the fraternities of fishermen. In some cases, I would say more dedicated than trout fishermen. The Corps of Engineers projects of this sort, of course, are very large. A lot of money, a lot of construction work. So construction companies and construction unions were interested in this project too, and very much supporters of it. So you have a lot of different players with conflicting values and desires, different economic and social stakes.
Well, you'd mentioned that Brendan Byrne hadn't really taken a solid position one way or another during the campaign. Did you also get that feel within the department that you had the freedom to take a fresh look at this and could come out on either side of building or not building this project?
Yeah, very definitely. The Department of Environmental Protection had, I would say, relatively modest water supply responsibilities at that time. Water supply was primarily, though not with the state agencies, but rather with county and local agencies and the private water companies. So dealing with a big water project, a big dam project, was relatively new for DEP. The the governor had taken the public position. He wanted a fresh look. All of the internal discussions with the governor's office when I got there were that that was what he meant, that he in fact had an open mind. If the perceived needs of decades earlier were still the needs of today, or if there were new needs that justified it, including the cost that the state government would pay its share, not a very big portion of it, then his position would be in favor of it. On the other hand, if the needs of years and decades past were no longer valid, if there was another way to meet those needs that could be identified, or ways to meet those needs, then he would oppose the Tox Island Dam and support the alternatives.
Chris, another interest I assume that was involved that you didn't mention was sort of the pro-construction, the labor unions, the economic development interests who were concerned about long-term water supply, but also concerned about short-term jobs and building.
The short-term jobs I mentioned, the construction companies and construction unions, I don't recall that there was much interest in water-using industry in the project. The area where the reservoir would have been created that might have then led to a more consistently reliable supply of water in great quantities was really far from the industrial areas of New Jersey. It's really the upper Delaware, the Warren, Sussex County area, and the equivalent counties in Pennsylvania. Heavily recreational, really not very industrial. The dam, if it had been built, wouldn't have benefited the industries in Trenton, in Camden, or in the Philadelphia area where the river is more stable because of the tidal influence.
Well, take us a little further along with the decision making. What was your personal involvement, and how did you sort of finally see the decision process developing both within the department and with the advice to the governor?
Okay. Well, the key to me was the way that the governor and his immediate staff arranged that the states would have I won't say a commanding role, but a very prominent role in shaping the scope of work, the study plan, and the study implementation by the Corps of Engineers. This was unprecedented in the Corps' history. And the Corps of Engineers office in New York City and the primary contractor that the Corps hired to do the bulk of the work strongly resisted the mandate from Congress that the states have a steering committee that would not just review the study when it was done, but that would help define what went into the study from the very start. Tom O'Neill, a colleague of mine at DEP, and I were the two New Jersey representatives for this study committee. If I thought about it, I could probably remember the names from the New York State and the Pennsylvania people as well. The governors of the other two states hadn't grappled with this in the same way that Brendan did. And I think it's fair to say that Tom and I were the two dominant forces among the state representatives. And so we insisted that the scope of work deal with water conservation as a feature for the communities for which water supply was the dominant concern. We insisted that the study very carefully evaluate the rise and fall of the levels of the reservoir if it were to be built, to make sure that marinas wouldn't go dry in years of low rainfall, something that the Corps of Engineers had never looked into before. We insisted that there be an evaluation of alternative locations for smaller reservoirs solely within New Jersey, separate from the Delaware River, and also the analysis of whether the river could be used to supply those reservoirs in periods of high flow, or as a source of releasing water into the Delaware in periods of low flow to benefit the shad migration, for example. We also had a lot of influence on different dam construction techniques, different heights of the dam, and a lot of what I would call more civil engineering matters as well. It was a much broader analysis than the Corps had ever done and than this contracting firm had ever done. And they fought. But we had the law on our side, and we had the interest of the New Jersey congressional delegation to make sure that the Corps of Engineers didn't try to ignore the mandate of the law that commissioned the study. Over the months, and the whole study took the better part of 2.5 years. There was extensive public involvement at various stages and so on. Over the months, first the civilian employees of the construction company, the leadership of the main contracting firm, and then eventually and begrudgingly the civilian employees of the Corps of Engineers, and then finally the military officers in the Corps of Engineers came around. They saw that they were not going to get the study done with anything like the schedule that they'd been given by the law unless they did what the steering committee said. And I think it's fair to say that the issues that we had them analyzed opened their eyes. These were dam builders, pure and simple, both the construction company and the Corps people. It opened their eyes to the role that water conservation could play. It opened their eyes to looking at alternatives for water supply. Instead of one big structure and a big reservoir, smaller reservoirs in adjacent locations, and then the interplay between the river and filling these smaller reservoirs at a higher elevation. They came around, and in subsequent years, actually the construction company, the engineering company that did most of the work, the consulting firm, made this type of study a specialty. They turned the approach that they were forced into at Tox Island into a line of business, and they are still in that business today.
Now, you mentioned the complicated politics of these large water supply projects. Any anecdotes or remembrances of your personal role in dealing with some of the respective interests?
Well, after all these years, I can't remember too many specific, what I would call, political forces. I participated personally in virtually all of the public meetings and hearings that were held, especially those on the New Jersey side. I remember having my heart wrenched by reports from people whose homes had been destroyed in the flood or who had lost family members. The Corps of Engineers had gotten far enough along to purchase some properties in New Jersey in particular, along the upper Delaware, where the reservoir would have flooded the land, and had torn down some of these homes already in advance of the major decision to go forward. There were some heartrending stories of people who lost their family homes, in some cases family homes for 3 or 4 generations. Those made a difference in my thinking. In many cases it was already done, homes already destroyed, washed away. But clearly the construction of the dam, had it occurred, would have taken even a larger toll on existing homes. The topography is such that was more of a problem for New Jersey homeowners than it was for Pennsylvania or New York homeowners. It's just not as steep on the Jersey side along the Delaware as it is along the Pennsylvania side. Most Pennsylvania homes were high on bluffs, well above the height of what the eventual reservoir might have been. In New Jersey, it would have spread a lot further inland. I do remember hearing presentations by the construction companies and the construction unions. This would have been a multi-year project involving hundreds to thousands of workers at their varying stages. That certainly was a factor, but I don't remember any undue influences being exercised by that constituency. The shad fishermen were out in force, especially during shad season, that was just part of the picture.
And of course, there were many people circulating petitions, I guess, on both sides of the issue to some extent.
Yeah, I would say there were more petitions against the dam because the opposition had been growing, I would say probably for a 10-year period or more before the Brendan Burns election. Maybe longer, the opposition was growing. And in terms of petitions, demonstrations, they were a lot more active than the proponents. The proponents of the dam were very prominent at the public hearings and then in providing assertions, sometimes data, to the study process, the study committee, the Corps of Engineers, and its consultant.
Well, take us down to what you recall these many years later about hearing of the governor's final decision, and in what context was that?
Well, the true inside story is the Corps of Engineers eventually published what I recall was a 5-volume report. There was one main summary volume and then 4 appendices that had been through a very careful vetting by the steering committee all the way along the line and subject to public comment that dealt with the whole range of issues that I mentioned. There was a big section on alternative water supplies, on fish ladders for the shad, and so on and so forth. The little-known part of this is that the governor asked the Commissioner of Environmental Protection for a brief, separate, confidential white paper on the pros and cons of the proposal as embodied in the 5-volume, and separately advice on alternatives not covered in the 5 volumes that appeared to DEP to be feasible solutions. This was reduced to a volume that was about this thick, with a small number of maps in it that I helped write, that was delivered to the governor on a confidential basis. I think there's only a handful of copies in existence. I still have one in my personal library. And the key feature of that report was that using the partial analysis of alternatives for water supply that the Corps and its contractor had done, and some additional analyses that we had done at DEP beyond that, assessing, for example, where the state held lands that could be suitable for reservoirs, we identified 2 locations, Round Valley and I can't remember the name of the other one. Spruce Run, which could provide locations for small-scale reservoirs at a much lower cost to the state taxpayer overall, that would provide reliable water supplies for those parts of the state, which were the ones where potable water shortages were among the most frequent. That was the key substantive finding. There was another way to meet that need without affecting the mainstream of the Delaware. We also emphasized some of the dramatic findings that the Corps of Engineers and its contractor probably wouldn't have stressed but for the steering committee. And that was the fact that under the Corps of Engineers' planned operating regime, the reservoir, depending on the rainfall and snowmelt in a given year, would rise and fall many tens of feet, which meant that the proposed marina locations would often be dry. You would often have huge mud flats from the area where you could drive to with your car and your boat and the actual waterway, so that the recreational values basically that had been asserted were a sham. Maybe 1 year out of every several, the marinas would have been wet. Those were, I think, at least to my mind, the 2 main points that really argued against the construction of the dam. Other things were important in some cases troubling, the further loss of homesteads for people on the New Jersey side especially. Whether the fish ladders would actually work for the shad, I kind of doubted it, but there were those who said there were better ways to build fish ladders in the 70s than there had been in earlier years. They were important but not controlling. But the fact that the recreational values were gone and there was a way to meet the legitimate water supply needs less expensively were, to me, the two compelling points. And we gave the report to the governor. I was not there when he and his immediate staff analyzed it, so I really don't know which of the features were the ones that made him conclude the Tox Island Dam was a bad idea. But within a day or two after getting that report, he came out against the dam. And without the support of one of the governors in the 3 states, it basically was a dead issue.
With the luxury of the many years since that decision was made, are you comfortable with the decision? We, of course, have had floods and occasional periods of drought that have occasionally, I guess, provoked questions of whether that decision was correct.
I still think it was the right decision. We have the water reservoirs now, too. They came some years later to take care of the water supply problem. And I don't think there has been any of the floods as destructive as that one in the 50s. So I still think it was the right decision. Obviously, it's potentially taking the long term to the future. It is a reversible decision. I mean, if patterns of water need and urban development, so on and so forth, change dramatically along the upper Delaware, the decision could be revisited. Not building the dam, which is true for water. I've since been involved in another big one in the northern U.S. Not building the dam now doesn't preclude building the dam if factual circumstances change years or typically decades ahead. But I think it was the right decision at the time. And as I understand the conditions, I still think that would be the correct decision right now in 2008.
And of course, the Tox Island issue led later to the state developing in the Byrne administration a statewide water supply master plan.
Exactly. In fact, I sometimes wonder if the development, the Tox Island decision, which identified these 2 possible relatively affordable reservoir sites, and the subsequent change in laws and requirements for DEP to put them in a much more significant role planning for water supplies for the state, wasn't in fact one of the most important results of the Tox Island decision. Those efforts started, I would say the State Water Master Plan started as a pretty direct consequence of the Tox Island Dam no-go decision. Or put another way, if the decision had been yes to go with the Tox Island Dam, then that would have taken care of the water supply needs for the northern, a big hunk of the northern part of the state for many, many years in the future. DEP did get the role to do the state water plan. I had an equivalent role in managing that study process as well in subsequent years.
And as you point out, the department also geared up in terms of resources and staff in the water supply area for the first time in New Jersey's history.
Yes, which still continues today.
What were the other issues as you first take your role on in DEP that you recall in those early months?
There were quite a number based on what I know you've covered with other people. I'll pick one that I don't think they've talked about yet, which was Cancer Alley. Just about the same time that I joined DEP, the National Cancer Institute, a branch of the National Institutes of Health, published 2 thin books of maps in living color, maybe I should say dead color, showing by county the cancer rates across the entire country for the previous 20 or 25 years. The details were quite extensive: type of cancer, site of cancer, males versus females, black females versus white females, et cetera, et cetera. But the overall pattern red were the counties with the highest levels of cancer rates, was that New Jersey was mostly red. It led to the nickname of New Jersey being Cancer Alley. There were other highly industrialized zones of the U.S., parts of New England, parts of the Texas and Louisiana Gulf Coast, parts of California, parts of Alabama, that were also red. But New Jersey was distinguished, as it were, by being the state where most of its counties, in some cases all of its counties, were in this red zone. No causes were included in this report. It was looking retrospectively at death rates and incident rates of cancer. Already, New Jersey was concerned about air pollution, had been for some years, actually, dating into the late 60s, before I was in the state. Water pollution was a growing concern I would say in the 70s, probably not much earlier than that in the state. And the assertion was that it's the environment, in particular environmental pollution, that was the source of this. This was big news in all parts of the country which had red counties, including New Jersey. The governor recognized the news and basically directed the Department of Environmental Protection to look into it. We were fortunate in that we had arranged some funding from the federal government, from the White House Council on Environmental Quality, to begin to look for chemicals as opposed to common pollutants, trace chemicals in the environment. And so we took that funding, we set up an office called the Program on Environmental Cancer and Toxic Substances, and began to mount a systematic look to see if there were any correlations that could be found between the then current pollution levels, not just the standard pollutants, but the more subtle, harder, and more costly to measure ones, and the red counties. That program still continues today too, by the way, albeit at a somewhat lower level. The details are rich. I'll only highlight a couple here. With that funding, well, let's see, I should say at about the same time, our water division was beginning to find unusual chemicals in certain water wells around the state. Not chemicals from septic tanks, but rather industrial chemicals, solvents, pesticides, that sort of thing. They weren't looking systematically, but they were beginning to find them, more or less, I'll say, by accident. There wasn't any systematic requirement for screening. Some of these chemicals, however, have a distinct odor that people were reporting typically when they were taking a shower. The chemicals in the warm water would evaporate. As we looked at these episodically, we discovered in some cases they were exceeding drinking water standards. And that led us to close certain wells and certain well fields. We decided that we should be systematic about this. So we mounted a statewide groundwater survey focusing on drinking water supply wells. This was the first time this had ever been done by any state on a comprehensive basis. And we found, I'm not sure which way I was surprised. We found about 10% of the wells that we sampled had something in them of man-made nature, industrial in nature, not agricultural in nature, except for certain pesticides. Given the population density of New Jersey, the industrialization, etc., even at that time, I still can argue it both ways. Was 10% high, or maybe was it low? At any event, we found the 10%. Different chemicals in different areas. Very often in South Jersey, it was pesticides that had not been used for many, many years. Pesticides containing lead or arsenic, DDT, for example. In the northern and central part of the states, it tended to be industrial chemicals. We closed those wells. And even though we didn't have a fund for it, we provided or helped the communities find alternative pure water supplies. We then started to investigate the sources of the groundwater contamination. And more often than not, for these industrial chemicals, we found an old dump nearby that had taken industrial waste, what we would now call hazardous waste. This was, of course, before any federal or state law regarding the disposal and proper treatment of industrial hazardous waste. And even though the technical tools available at the time were pretty primitive, we were able to persuade ourselves and others that these old abandoned dumps were very likely the source of these contaminants in well waters, which could be some distance away, in some cases quite a distance away. We took this information as it emerged to the governor, and to his credit, he said, keep going. I'd rather find the polluted wells and close them down, even if it gets in the press, than have New Jersey residents drink bad water. And there was bad press as we found these wells and shut them down. Sometimes the communities had difficulty finding alternative water sources very quickly. We had to bring water in by tank trucks in some locations, which never leads to good news in the newspaper as well. This story could go on for a long, long time, but as you know from your position there, the end result was an introduction of what was originally called the Spill Conservation and Control Act, the first state Superfund bill, specifically to deal with the cleanup of old dumps and industrial facilities that were releasing contaminants not only to groundwater, which is what led us down this path in the first place, but to surface water. Rivers, bays were often affected, and also into the air. This was the first effective state Superfund bill in the country. And when we got the bill passed with significant dollars, not just this small federal grant that we had, but with real money, millions of dollars in tax revenues to deal with these problems, fix them, provide alternative water supplies, that led to the state Superfund program, which was shortly thereafter mimicked to a significant degree in California and New York State and a few other states, and then a few years after that, of course, by the federal Superfund bill as well. New Jersey, even today, has more designated Superfund sites on the federal list than any other state, and the simple reason for that is we started looking for and finding them because we had the state law and the funds from the state law to do it with.
Another water quality issue that came to become a very major initiative of the Byrne administration was sewage construction and expanding significantly the number of facilities that were treating sewage to potable water standards. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? Yeah,
that was a major success. I can't claim any direct role in that. That was under the leadership of my colleague, Rocco Ricky, who probably has been mentioned by other interviewees, and who was brought into the state. Rocco was an engineer, I was a scientist. We were both political appointees, but we were brought in for our scientific and technical expertise. Rocco was a very major figure in the federal EPA office in Region 2 regarding municipal sewage treatment, construction of wastewater treatment facilities, sewer lines, and so on. So that was the reason that he was brought in, New Jersey resident, by the way. That's the reason that he was brought into DEP shortly before I was, actually, but very, very early on in the Byrne administration. The history, as I recall it, is that for reasons that perhaps have as much to do with home rule as anything else in the state, the state's cities and towns and sewage treatment authorities had simply not gone to get in line to get the federal money for building sewage collection systems and sewage treatment plants that was made available by the 1972 Federal Water Pollution Control Act. Huge quantities of money were available to cover the lion's share, I think it's 90% or more of the share of the cost for municipalities to bring their sewage treatment up to snuff. And New Jersey simply hadn't tried to get the money. Rocco Ricky and his newly assembled team helped break that logjam. DEP itself got some of the money, but much of their effort was put in to help the existing sewage authorities figure out how to prepare a credible application with the necessary plans and construction diagrams to get the money and put it to work and build the sewage treatment plants. And so what was just a trickle of federal funds in 1972, 73, 74 turned into a very significant flow of funds in the middle part of that decade, and that in turn led to a large number of new sewer collection systems and sewage treatment plants being built across the state, primarily I would say in the northern two-thirds of the state, which in turn led almost immediately to a dramatic improvement in surface water qualities in streams and rivers, creeks, and even the bays all across the state. The goal of the federal water bill in 1972 was fishable and swimmable waters. That's a very demanding criteria. It means all sorts of pollution have to be reduced to levels that are either zero or tolerable by aquatic life and not posing a threat to people who swim in the rivers. New Jersey did not reach that goal by 1979. I think that was the original goal, nor did any other state. But New Jersey moved ahead, I think, much faster than most other states in reaching that goal. Waters that had been closed to fishing became open to fishing. Waters that were sometimes closed to swimming became open to swimming once again.
Before we move on from the water area, any other memories of specific controversies, issues, or projects? We've heard in other interviews during this series about the chemical control controversy in Elizabeth, and there were others scattered around the state. Any particular issues that stick in your mind today?
There was a proposal for offshore oil and gas drilling in the Byrne administration in the federal waters several miles off the Jersey shore, and also off New England and off Georgia as well. It was part of the energy independence idea of the Nixon administration. And these, of course, were areas where there had been no oil or natural gas exploration, unlike the coast of California, which had such development and associated oil spills, and also in the Gulf of Mexico. At that time, the tourism industry in New Jersey was the third largest industry. The oil and chemical industry was first, agriculture was second, and tourism, I think, was third in terms of dollar value to the state. And it was overwhelmingly based on the Jersey shore. This led to a great deal of concern on the part of the governor and his staff. For that reason alone, in addition, the Tourism Bureau was concerned, and DEP was concerned because of the possible effects of oil spills and also the potential onshore development of oil processing facilities, potentially even oil processing facilities, such as refineries, in or along the Jersey shore. We opposed the drilling, the proposed drilling and exploration. And here I think the governor deserves a lot of credit. He persuaded the governors of the other coastal states. We originally had all of the original 13 colonies of the U.S., from Maine to Florida, joined together in an organized group that fought for the revision of the federal offshore drilling law that would give states much more responsibility in shaping and guiding the decisions regarding exploration and production. I was the governor's representative on that group. It was people like me from the other states. And we, with some help from some other coastal states, undertook a campaign to get major revisions in that law that didn't give states a veto. It couldn't, because these were in federal waters beyond the state's jurisdiction. Major revisions in that law that took into account state legitimate concerns. That law, that was now 25 years ago that was changed. It's now somewhat out of date and needs revision too, but at the time it was a major, major change, strongly resisted by the oil and gas industry.
And talk more about the political context. You mentioned the tourism industry's interests in being protected, but there were also countervailing economic forces arguing for this from an industrial development standpoint, and also the jobs involved in constructing pipelines and ports and so forth.
I think the fact that the New Jersey oil and gas and chemical industry was not already in the production mode, that is, there's no onshore oil and gas resources in New Jersey, or for that matter, the other 13 colonies, meant that that industry only had its downstream users who were used to getting their raw materials by ship or by pipeline. They didn't have the full array of force that they could bring to bear on the original 13 colonies. I spent a lot of time in Louisiana and Texas during that period. And there it's quite different, because they not only have the refineries and the processing facilities, but they also have the production. And so the employment base on the production side and exploration side is important in those states. And therefore, it had a bigger voice. Here, we only had the downstream users. And yes, they were present. The New Jersey Petroleum Council was not very happy with the governor in those days. But it didn't have the overall force and power that it would have in a state where it was already a fully mature, the full cycle of the industry. The tourism industry, of course, was front and center with their concerns. And I would say, particularly along the Jersey Shore, welcomed the governor's position and supported it very, very strongly.
And of course, the context economically at that time was that New Jersey was going through a very difficult period economically with very high unemployment and many interests prodding the governor for more pro-economic development actions, at least in their perspective. How did that sort of influence decision-making, if at all, within the department?
Well, it didn't. You know, we were the Department of Environmental Protection, not the Department of Economic Development. So those forces would have exercised their pressure on other arms of the government. We were mindful of them. They would often appear at hearings where we, DEP, would be testifying before the relevant federal agencies, for example. But I didn't see any undue influence on our analyses on the environmental aspects of the program at all. Other parts of the administration probably did, but we were insulated from that very significantly.
But apart from seeing them at hearings, so there was no cross-departmental lobbying saying, couldn't you guys ease off that we may lose an Exxon or someone else?
No, and I think it was because of the mix. I mean, at that point we had the Department of Labor and Industry, the fused department, and I remember talking to some of their senior people, including an economist that worked there. He said, well, so suppose we bring in the oil and gas industry with its ratio of employment per $1 million of revenue produced, and contrast to the tourism industry and the number of employees per $1 million of revenue that produces. Well, tourism is a lot more labor intensive than oil and gas production. So in terms of the employment picture, what we had was better than what we would have. And in addition, if the oil and gas exploration had gone in, even in one small area, the reputation would affect the whole Jersey Shore. So I think from the employment point of view, it was probably in favor of the status quo instead of bringing in the new industry.
Why don't we take a short break? Glenn, why don't we expand a bit more on the cancer issue in New Jersey, since it was so significant and so controversial at that time?
Yeah. One dimension of it that I think is worth emphasizing, because it did help show that the problem is more complicated than those simple maps made it appear, and that the potential causes of cancer are more diverse. I think this penetrated not only within the state government agencies, but I think led to a broader understanding by the public at large, or at least the fraction of the public that pays attention to this, is that our little group in DEP, along with some of the physicians in the state health department, knew enough already to be convinced that it couldn't just be things in the air and things in the water. Just take cigarettes, for example. Everybody knows the association between cigarette smoking and lung cancer, even at that time. Now we know even other cancers are involved. So in addition to the groundwater study, in addition to mounting some more sophisticated air studies, tracking the underwater plumes back to the old dumps and that sort of thing, we commissioned a team at Rutgers to look more deeply into other factors that could be associated with these high cancer rates. Probably most people watching this know that certain groups of the population, because of their diets, have certain cancers increased. For example, the nitrates that are involved in preserved foods, bacon, salamis, that sort of thing. Subgroups that eat a lot of that kind of food have higher stomach and colon cancer rates than the general public. And there were data, even at that time in the mid to late 70s, about smoking habits by ethnic group, by geographic location, drinking habits, alcoholic beverage habits, dietary habits, preserved versus non-preserved foods, whole grains versus processed foods, and so on. So we commissioned a group at Rutgers that was led by a very bright, mathematically oriented guy named Michael Greenberg, to gather all of these other data sets, including air pollution levels, water pollution levels, but also ethnic information, smoking habits, sales of tobacco, and so on, and see what lay behind these summary maps. And he came out with a series of studies that showed the complexity of probable cause and effect, or even associations, between some of these other factors and high cancer rates. There's some that are really quite striking. New Jersey had, my memory is anywhere near accurate, 4 counties in the southern part of New Jersey that had the highest rate for male bladder cancer in the whole country. Of the 3,016 counties in the United States, the 4 highest for this cancer were in South Jersey. Well, it turns out a significant fraction of the workforce there worked at one large chemical plant where a specific chemical known to cause bladder cancer was used for many, many years, decades even, and not controlled. So they were exposed to this chemical uniquely, the workforce from these 4 counties, and that's why they ended up with that high rate for that particular cancer. And he was able to demonstrate this type of cause, effect, or at least association for many other factors besides air and water pollution levels. In addition, we did some targeted studies in certain counties, very expensive, and in some cases pioneering at the time, looking in drinking water, not reservoirs, but in tap water, and looking in air at nose level for certain suspect chemicals that might be associated with certain types of cancer. And we were never able to find, of course this was relatively primitive at that time, we were never able to find hot spots of specific air pollution chemicals or water pollution chemicals that we could correlate with any of these maps. This is now, I think, widely understood in 2008 that cancer has multiple causes. The genetic factors involved, the interplay between genetics and individual lifestyle choices, diet, so on and so forth, is better understood than it was then. But I think through that whole set of things, dealing with some obvious causes, the Superfund sites, polluted water, and so on, and then showing that it's other things as well, things in people's individual control to some degree, in some cases culturally determined, that led to this picture of cancer.
Another environmental health issue that was first getting attention during the 1970s in the Byrne administration was the impact of asbestos on the health. And as I recall, there was some initial scientific disagreement within the New Jersey bureaucracy in terms of how significant asbestos was as a health risk.
Well, by that time, it was well known, at least to those who were seriously concerned about worker health, that certain occupations that were exposed, at least to certain types of asbestos, had a very high rate of certain types of lung cancer, especially if they were smokers, and in particular for one especially rare lung tumor called mesothelioma. Now, some in the industry, the asbestos producing and using industry, weren't willing to act on that knowledge yet, but scientifically, I would say anyone who was objective or who was concerned about worker health was already convinced of that. I was among those people because I had done some of my final PhD work in the late 60s in the laboratory at Mount Sinai headed by a man named Irving Selikoff, who was one of the first physician researchers to discover this correlation in workers. What wasn't at all clear, and I would say still is not totally resolved, is whether less intense exposure to typical people, not people who are working with making things of asbestos, destroying things with asbestos like tearing down buildings, were exposed. But the techniques for monitoring asbestos in the air had advanced significantly in the last few years at that time, and there were some inexpensive tests available. And most buildings that were in existence in the 70s had been built with asbestos insulation for fireproofing. We discovered in some schools in New Jersey that during normal maintenance operations to replace insulation, that asbestos fibers were released into the school. Not as much as in an asbestos mine, for example, and not as much as when a building was being improperly torn down without wetting down the dust and without respiratory protection for the workers, but still easily detected. Everybody knows children are more sensitive than adults to many different kinds of pollutants. Asbestos develops cancer only after decades, 20 years typically in adults if it's going to occur. And so the concern was children in this more sensitive period exposed to levels not as high as workers, but partway there at a sensitive time in their life. Was this a risk? We collectively decided it was worth doing something about, especially because you can do things about it relatively inexpensively. Don't do the work when the kids are there. Wet it down. Screen off the areas where the work is being done with plastic sheeting that's tightly taped, so that the workers, who by then were wearing appropriate protective masks, would be where the asbestos was, but the kids wouldn't. This concern, I think, was justified. It was overreacted to, I would say, in some communities. It did lead to the passage of a federal law a few years later, specifically regarding asbestos remediation projects in schools. And on balance, I would say it was an appropriate protective action to take place. One of the issues, of course, in taking steps to prevent health consequences is you never can fully total up what you've prevented. But my view, and I think the way the governor supported us in closing the drinking water wells that were contaminated, let's not take the risk of sick or dead people when we can do something about it. That was, by the way, a consistent theme of his, I think, across his entire administration.
Of course, historically, New Jersey had been a major producer of asbestos through the Johns Manville plant in Manville.
The studies of the workers at the Manville plant are among those that showed the high cancer rates. And believe it or not, there were some Superfund dump sites around Manville and the vicinity where the major contaminant that we had to deal with the state Superfund bill was asbestos fibers. If they're on the ground and they're covered and capped even primitively, they're fine. But if you start disrupting them, for example, through a construction project to build a new building on an old dump, and you don't pay attention, you can release very substantial quantities of asbestos to the neighbors in the immediate vicinity, not to mention the workers.
We had briefly mentioned the chemical control plant or tank farm in Elizabeth. I think you had some further comments you wanted to make.
Yes, I already mentioned the number of sites that we found early on. There were some other bad ones, large quantities of barrels, large quantities of liquid fuels. There were fires and explosions at some of these plants, usually the ones that we didn't know about until the fire or explosion occurred. The chemical control plant was one of them. It's the one that I handled. I handled a lot of them directly, but it's the one that is most vivid in my mind because it was the largest drum dump in the history of the country. And I mean, the history stretches over a few years, but suffice it to say, in a very short period of time, under a new set of owners, a typical size drum dump of 10,000 barrels, 55-gallon barrels, that was operating more or less acceptably to burn certain classes of hazardous waste, exploded to 35,000 barrels, which were not only not being treated properly any longer, but were allowed to rust and leak. And also that facility collected a variety of materials, hazardous waste, that it was not licensed to collect. Explosives, out-of-date nerve gas type pesticides, for example, material contaminated with infectious microorganisms, botulinum, for example, which they were not supposed to take, and a whole witch's brew of other things. The regulatory history takes more time to talk about than we have here today. It did eventually come under the direct control, not the regulatory, but the direct control of the state DEP Superfund program, which I set up and ran. And we had to defuse it, which we did with great care and attention to protecting the neighbors as well as our own workers. The barrels were so tightly packed on that site, you couldn't get to many of them even to measure what was in them, let alone pick them up, repackage them if necessary, and send them to the right kind of a treatment or disposal facility. It took us about a year to get rid of the worst materials, explosives, the radioactive materials, the bacterial contamination, the compressed gas cylinders, et cetera, et cetera. The many fuses, leaving behind only a lot of drums, which we thought were relatively low danger in a toxic sense and relatively low hazard from an explosive sense, and also we thought not too burnable. That was based on being able to sample the ones around the edge, but not the ones in the middle. Turns out it was the end of the governor's term. I was not likely to continue in the next administration, no matter who won the election. So I changed jobs at that stage for that facility. A year later, turns out on the anniversary of Earth Day, it did catch fire in the center of the drums that were left. It was on the front page of all the newspapers in New York. It was on national news. It's the last Superfund site that was on national TV news. Spectacular orange mushroom clouds and throwing barrels many, many yards away. Impossible to put out. No neighbors were affected. Some firemen who had not taken seriously the need to wear protective equipment were affected. The state police who were on scene and the state DEP people who were trained to wear protective equipment were not affected by the fire. Only the ones who didn't take protection seriously were affected. And as a consequence, in part, the federal Superfund bill was passed and signed just a few months later. That galvanized the country's attention at least as much as Times Beach and Love Canal, where the main problems were surface water and groundwater, not exploding mushroom clouds, were the cause.
Another area that probably wasn't as directly under your personal supervision was solid waste, but give us an overview of where solid waste was in the Byrne administration as a program and where it is today.
You're right, solid waste was not in my purview. It wasn't toxic enough, I guess. The dumps in the Meadowlands had already in large part been closed by the time the Byrne administration took office. Some were still in operation, accepting municipal refuse from New York City as well as northern New Jersey. And one of the successful efforts under the Hackensack Meadowlands Development Commission, which I believe was created in the pre-Byrne, but brought to full staffing and authority in the Byrne administration, was to cap and close the existing landfills, put in the appropriate monitoring networks to detect and then collect polluted groundwater before it reached the marshes, and develop some very nice recreational amenities. All of that, I think, is one of the great success stories for northern New Jersey, certainly. The solid waste, much of the solid waste, I would say in the early 70s, was still going to poorly designed dumps as opposed to landfills. During the 70s, both as a function of law and regulation, federal and state, and a function of technology developments, it became clearer, not cheaper, but clearer, how to build a landfill for solid waste that would acceptably confine the waste and the liquids that are generated by the waste and keep them from seeping out and affecting groundwater, potentially drinking water wells, or into surface waters. More often than not, dumps are right at the edge of a body of water someplace. And this solid waste was then and still is primarily a local and county responsibility. It's not really a state responsibility to run the landfills. But the regulations and the pressure that was put on counties and municipalities to do better by their solid waste increased dramatically. I haven't heard about a problem with seepage from a municipal landfill in New Jersey for a long, long time now. It used to be quite common, particularly on surface streams, discolored fish kills, et cetera, et cetera. In addition, of course, in more recent years, recycling has kicked in, which has helped remove some of the volume and then some of the most troubling components of the solid waste stream, the things that can produce more toxic chemical releases, as opposed to just the organic loading, the traditional smelly stuff that you can get out of trash.
Another policy that was initiated in the Byrne administration, although I think its origins were more in the legislature than in the administration itself, that had a somewhat less successful record, was trying to get each county to develop a plan and a process for disposing of its own waste. Describe the initial sort of concept and also the problems that were encountered as that policy was implemented.
Well, it was true not only for solid waste but for water pollution control as well. The federal law certainly for water at one point required county-wide planning for water pollution control. It's a program that was national in scope. Federal funds were available. It never really was very successful in New Jersey or any place else. Actually, I saw it working out in some other places as well. For trash, it was an inside the state initiative to force the counties to do better, plan, integrate their transportation for solid waste, find central locations, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, again, home rule is part of the reason that that didn't take hold. In the best of circumstances, nobody wants a landfill. Then they're usually called dumps, even if they're well designed and engineered. But the home rule tradition is so strong, and the county's ability to get the warring communities to face the trade-offs and maybe trade some money around just never really took hold in New Jersey. I don't know that I've lived and worked in about 8 different states in my career. I don't know that any state has ever done it right in the big sense. Some metropolitan regions have found ways to balance the equities and the costs within a major metropolitan area that might include multiple counties and different cities, and do the horse trading so that a landfill or an incineration facility located in one area, that area gets some goodies, extra tax revenues. But on a statewide basis, I don't think anybody has done it right yet, including New Jersey.
And in addition to the home rule problems, I think some of the counties in New Jersey, at least, after building very expensive incinerator facilities, found they didn't have enough waste to meet the revenue projections.
Yeah. This was after my period in office. That's also not unique to New Jersey. And there have been examples of the capability of incinerators being oversold to the municipality or the county that's decided to buy them.
An area that I know you had much more personal involvement in was nuclear energy, both in terms of the decisions involving nuclear facilities in New Jersey and more dramatically with the 3 Mile Island emergency in Pennsylvania that affected New Jersey directly. Why don't we talk first about the licensing issues involved in New Jersey plants?
Well, at the start of the Byrne administration, the only reactor that existed was Oyster Creek, which still exists today and is the oldest operating reactor in the United States, a fairly small reactor, built in the early days of nuclear reactor design. On that particular one, we had concerns early in the Byrne administration about its ability to put a lot of water on the reactor core if something went wrong with the normal cooling system. because it was such an early design, it didn't have the redundancy that other reactors that were being designed and built in the 70s had. And so we commissioned a special study at DEP that led the owners of that reactor to upgrade its emergency cooling system. They didn't like the idea. They were about to get a relicensing decision from the federal government at that time, and we made it pretty clear that unless they volunteered to add this additional, it's like a belt and suspenders approach, to deal with this rare, at that time had not yet occurred, problem of a core meltdown, that we would likely make it known to the federal government that we wanted this done. They agreed to do that. In addition, Public Service was proposing to build new reactors in 2 locations. One is in southern New Jersey, using the Delaware River as a cooling source, and also what was a new design, not yet built, a floating nuclear reactor, barge-mounted reactors that would be located within the 3-mile limit within New Jersey state waters in a breakwater. The land-based reactors came under the state's coastal zone law for approval. They were within the geographic border of that. And in the review and approval of those during my tenure, we were able, using the coastal zone law, to impose certain additional safety and other restrictions on them beyond what the federal government was requiring. The utility was not happy about those additional requirements, but they eventually accepted those. So I actually signed the permit for 2 of those in southern New Jersey, the state permit. The 2 floating nuclear reactors, which were coming along about the same time, presented serious problems to us. And it's really simply stated, if you want to have a lot of weight around a reactor so that if the core melts, you can catch the core before it reaches the outside air. There's huge quantities of radioactivity, I mean, much equivalent to a nuclear weapon, basically. If it's going to float, you can't have that much weight around it. There's not that much protection. And in addition, if something were to melt and hit water, it's really like white hot steel and the other stuff. You get what's called a steam explosion, which is like a massive chemical explosion. You just vaporize water, and so your distribution pattern of the radionuclides gets much worse than if it's falling into ground. And it's a difference, even if the ground is wet, you don't get this steam explosion problem. So we were very concerned about this floating nuclear, this brand new idea. Sufficiently so that we challenged it at the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the licensing proceeding, which didn't make the utility very happy either. And we prevailed. I wouldn't say it wasn't for the steam explosion reason. The economics did in those 2 proposals as much as our technical concerns. And so the utility withdrew the idea for those 2 altogether. So we could say, I disapproved those 2. So I have the most even-handed record you can ever have on nuclear power, prove 2 and stop 2. As part of the requirements of the federal government on states that have reactors, you have to have an emergency plan in case the worst does happen. And we at DEP had that responsibility. We developed a plan for the reactors in South Jersey and the Oyster Creek reactor on the evacuation and emergency monitoring and some other things that was accepted by the federal government. In those days, the federal government didn't approve a plan. They either accepted it or they rejected it. In our case, they accepted our reactor emergency plans.
Glenn, before our break, you had been talking about nuclear siting and licensing issues. Why don't we continue along that line?
As I mentioned, the state plan for its existing reactors was accepted, not approved, but accepted as opposed to rejected by the federal government. So we had in place a nuclear reactor accident protocol, including mobilization, evacuation, distribution of potassium iodide to protect the thyroid glands of kids especially, and other public communications and so on. And we tested that regularly. 1 year it would be around the reactors in South Jersey, the next year around Oyster Creek. And while you can never be totally satisfied with such a plan, we thought we were in as good a shape as anybody could be, really, at the state level.
And of course, the siting of Oyster Creek was a particular problem because of its location.
Yes, and that was done very early on because...
Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, Oyster Creek was built at a time when Ocean County's population was something like 1/4 of what it is now. And so the population to protect and evacuate has exploded around the reactor, which means that any evacuation is more problematic than it would have been at the time the reactor is built. And that's of concern today to some of the residents of Ocean County. Some are still in favor of it. Contributes a lot to the taxes for the county. But it is a concern that has happened because of the growth around the reactor, not anything about the reactor itself.
And also the problems of evacuating people along the peninsula
and the Jersey Shore, yes. Yes. Not unique to Oyster Creek. A lot of them are located along coastal areas because they need cooling water. And very often growth has occurred around them as well. I'm thinking particularly the ones in the southeastern United States. But we had the plan, so, which was, we thought, as good as it could be, and it's even better now because there's a much more extensive monitoring network, real-time monitoring network for radionuclides around all of the nuclear plants in New Jersey. My successors at DEP, I had a briefing on that just a few months ago, have done a remarkable job of improvement. But then came the year 1979, when the dreaded accident that had never occurred, the meltdown of a core of a reactor, occurred at one of the two reactors at 3 Mile Island, which is on the Susquehanna River, at its closest point to New Jersey, only about 30 miles away from New Jersey, along the Delaware. We, of course, knew that the reactor was there. It's not a New Jersey reactor, so we didn't have a plan for it. You were required under federal law to plan intensively for the 10-mile zone around a reactor. This was 30 miles away. And it brings back all sorts of memories. The plan required the Radiation Bureau to report to the state's chief radiation officer, that was me, if they knew of an event at a reactor in the state or any other major nuclear accident, and by implication a reactor upwind that might affect us, although that wasn't explicitly stated. And I was then to report to the deputy commissioner what I knew. That's what our plan said. The deputy commissioner reported to the commissioner reported to the governor's council, and the governor's council reported to the governor. That was our accepted federal plan. Well, I was running a meeting of the representatives of the 13 original colonies, this group that was concerned about oil and gas drilling, that Friday morning in the State Health Department's conference room. I remember it vividly. You don't forget incidents like this. We started at 8. And my most trusted aide came over from the DEP offices next door at 8:15 and said, "There's a problem at 3 Mile Island. The Radiation Bureau chief needs to talk to you." The meltdown had occurred at 7:45, I think, 7:30, 7:45. We heard about it from our colleagues in Pennsylvania, not from the federal government. So I went out, got on the phone. He told me, in essence, it looks like there's been a core meltdown. So I went back into my colleagues. I was chairing the meeting that day from the original 13 colonies, and I turned to the vice chairman. I said, "You better take over. I've got something I've got to deal with." And I went back to my office, got a little better picture in the next few minutes from the Radiation Bureau, went to talk to the deputy commissioner as planned, who was not technically trained, and said, "You better talk directly to the commissioner about this. I'm going to remove myself from the chain of communications." So I went and talked to the commissioner, who was David Bardeen at the time, and said, "This is what it looks like." And he said, "You better call the governor's council. You know what's going on, I don't." So I called the governor's council, and the governor's council said, "Let me talk to Brendan." Brendan immediately got on the phone, and then the commissioner and the council were out of the chain of communications. It was me directly to the governor. For other reasons, I already had the direct line in and that sort of thing, but we made sure that we could reach each other. What we did over the ensuing several hours was take the elements of the plan for the reactors in New Jersey and transpose them in real time to along the Delaware River. New Jersey is generally downwind of Delaware, of course, and the wind wouldn't have brought the radionuclides all along the river. It would bring it in a wedge, depending on which way the wind would be blowing, but the wedge might shift over time as the wind shifted. The state police was a full partner in our plan, and because of the work on the Chemical Control Association, I was very well acquainted with the commander of the state police at that time. So I reached him right away, and we basically, in real time, redesigned the state plan to mobilize state troopers with radiation monitors along the Delaware River.
That would have been Clint Pagano?
Yes, it was Clint Pagano. So that we had our own detectors on the edge of New Jersey. Our Radiation Bureau people, of course, went with the state police. But the state police could command a location wherever they needed it to be. And we began telling the public, by then it was big news already on CNN, telling the public selected aspects of what we were doing, that we were mobilizing our monitors, that we were in touch with the condition of the reactors. Yes, there was a serious accident, but there was no release, and so on and so forth. This is all coming back to me now. The governor and I were in fairly frequent contact during the course of that day. There was nothing really to report about a release, but for those who remember the event, an issue of concern emerged during that day, which was the hydrogen bubble. The concern, legitimate technical concern, was that the reactor core, which had melted and was in contact with the water that was pouring onto the core but not cooling it enough, would be ripped apart into hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen, of course, is flammable by itself. The core is that hot. And you would get this big enclosure of hydrogen gas with the oxygen gas, such that a spark could have set off the hydrogen in an explosive setting that might have been enough to rupture the steel and also the concrete building around it. Completely separate from the molten reactor dropping out the bottom and penetrating. And there's really no way to prevent that in this setting. It turns out that apparently the production of hydrogen later was estimated to not have been as significant as the early calculations suggested it might be. The governor called for a meeting of some of his cabinet the next morning, along with the utility operators of the two sets of reactors in New Jersey, first thing in the morning. in his office with, I mean, the Attorney General's office was represented, the Health Department, of course, was represented, State Police was represented, the Transportation Department was represented, the Agriculture Department was represented, because if there had been a release, it was more likely that South Jersey would have had the isotopes on it, the crops and so on, dairies, things like that. And during the discussion, which was rather heated between the health commissioner and I about whether to mobilize potassium iodide for kids, you know, this was now Saturday morning, no schools, but there were religious schools on Saturdays for the Jews and Sundays for everybody else. There would be an organized way to reach kids with potassium iodide pills if the thing had ruptured. And the health department commissioner and I were disagreeing about that. I was in favor of it, and she was concerned that it would cause panic. It was in large part her opposition. We got a phone call from the site, from the reactor. The federal government's Nuclear Regulatory Commission top team by then had been mobilized from Bethesda to the site. And the head of the team was the same individual that we were dealing with in challenging the floating nuclear reactors. Turns out by a happy coincidence. And so he got on the phone and introduced himself. The governor had arranged this with the White House the day before, and I didn't know about it. He said, have your top guy call me at 8:30 at this number. So he got on the phone and introduced himself, and the governor said, well, I'm here with Commissioner of Health Finley and Commissioner Bardeen and this one and that one and Dr. Paulson, who's our radiation officer. And he said, Glenn? And I said, I can't remember his first name now. Harold, yeah.
Denton.
Harold Denton, that's right, Harold Denton, thank you. And so we were like this on the floating nukes, but now we were comrades trying to deal with the consequences of 3 Mile Island. So he proceeded to tell us what they knew, which was more than the state of Pennsylvania people knew, not surprisingly, because they had the reactor engineer experts with them on the field. And among the things that they told us was the condition of the core, and that about 7% of it had melted, they estimated, and that radioiodine, among other things, was loose in the steel building. We set up a communication. Harold and I would talk once an hour for the rest of the day, and then we'd give it to our deputies overnight and so on. So we took care of all the emergency communications, and for the rest of the weekend we were in the monitoring mode, we were in the mobilizing mode for potassium iodide if there had been a rupture, and we were able to follow hour by hour what was going on at the reactor. The worst weekend passed. Eventually the reactor core started to cool. The risk of a release dwindled in probability to close to nothing over the next few days. Although we did keep our monitors on the scene along the Delaware for a couple of weeks after that to be on the safe side. So the country dodged a bullet, unlike at Chernobyl. It was a close call. Subsequently, the governor himself, Governor Byrne, participated personally in every reactor accident drill in the rest of his term of office. That experience persuaded him that he should do that, and we all welcomed that. None of his successors have done that, by the way, I understand from my longtime friends at DEP. The plan has been revised. The monitoring network for the reactors in New Jersey is much more extensive even than it was then. The planning zone has extended out farther now than the mandated miles from the federal government. And the whole process is technically a lot more robust than it was then. But I still remember that episode, that weekend in particular, and the way that the governor directed the response, trusted advice, and once again took the protective route.
Glenn, we've talked about a few air quality issues somewhat indirectly. Anything else you want to talk about the air quality program during the Byrne administration?
Well, I mean, I was living and working in New York for many years dealing with air pollution before then, and compared to what New York State was doing on air pollution control, and I would say even New York City, New Jersey was being much more aggressive on controlling particularly industrial sources of air pollution in the late 60s and early 70s than New York or New Jersey was. So when I came over, although I didn't supervise the Air Bureau, I already knew many of its key officials. I'd seen them at hearings testifying on federal air quality standards and that sort of thing, and was expecting to find a high-quality, aggressive air pollution control operation. That's what I found. And I was able to give them moral and in some cases financial support because of the federal funds that we were bringing in for this more sophisticated monitoring in the Byrne years. And the air quality was improving for standard industrial sources. There was a big issue, though, on auto exhaust and the inspection program, which was strongly resisted by automobile dealers and especially service shops, and to some extent by the public. And it did take us longer in years to implement the more stringent air pollution exhaust tailpipe monitoring program than we had originally planned. The tighter you set the limits, the more cars will fail. In most cases, then, and I think still today, the cars can be repaired with a modest tune-up. But that is money for the car owner to invest, and that was the source of the opposition. We eventually did get in place the better, the more extensive, tighter inspection controls for auto exhaust. And toward the end of the Byrne administration, just as the common air pollutants from factories had been going down nicely for several years, so too then the air pollution from automobiles, trucks, and buses began to go down as well. There were certain industries that, for I guess I would say historical or cultural reasons, strongly resisted the industrial pollution control requirements. And the one that I dealt with most directly was the glass industry in southern New Jersey, which resisted with every ounce of will that they could muster the imposition of the industrial stack pollution controls on the emissions from the glass industry. We eventually prevailed on that too, but that industry was the one that was the least willing to, I'll say, get with the program for stack emissions control.
And its opposition also became a political issue, I believe, when the governor ran for re-election.
It did. I think it played a role in South Jersey, as far as I could tell, not the rest of the state. And it was important probably in the communities where the glass industry was the major employer. And there were, I think, 5 significant glass plants in 4 different small cities at that time, if I'm remembering right.
Now, you didn't have direct responsibility for open space and conservation, but of course the Pinelands was the major environmental initiative during Governor Byrne's time. Any anecdotes or memories of those times?
Yes, I did get involved because of the water side of it. Many of the, there's just a fact about the Pine Barrens. It's mostly sandy soil, and it has therefore been a location for a lot of sand and gravel monitoring, or excavating for a couple of centuries. An empty sand and gravel pit makes an excellent illegal dump. And a lot of the wells that we were closing in the groundwater survey that I mentioned, when we traced the pollutants back, turned out to be old sand and gravel pits that had been used for municipal waste, or even worse, for hazardous waste. And there were some wonderful apocryphal stories about the haulers, the inappropriate haulers of liquid hazardous waste, who loved the Pine Barrens, because they could go down there, find a road, sandy road through the Pine Barrens, and find an old gravel pit, or even open the valve on the back of the truck and drive along, and the liquid would fall out on the sand, and in minutes to a few hours it would be gone. It would be soaking down into what is without doubt still, and certainly was then, the largest uncontaminated aquifer in the entire state. Very extensive acreage, outstanding water quality, and a potential future water supply source for much of the state. In fact, it probably still is considered in the master plan a future water supply source if surface reservoirs get unable to meet the demand. So we found a lot of wells. We found a lot of the old Superfund sites, and we were concerned about protecting that aquifer from future intrusions as well as cleaning up what was already there. And because the groundwater moves so fast, the linkage between groundwater and surface water is extremely intimate down there. I mean, you could almost, it sounds strange to think of it this way, but if you see a river, you're actually seeing where the groundwater under the banks comes into the open air. It's like you're slicing down into the groundwater. It's a little bit oversimplified, but not much. And so at the banks of a river, the flow between the groundwater and the surface water can go either way. If it rains and the river's higher, it's going to go back into the groundwater. If the river goes down, then the groundwater's going to come out. And it moves really fast in the sandy Pine Barrens. So the idea of protecting the water quality in the Pine Barrens from contamination with trace chemicals from improper and also illegal industrial waste disposal, that brought it into my turf. And in addition, we were reestablishing the surface water quality standards, the fishable, swimmable goal, and beginning to set them not only for the common water pollutants, but for the industrial pollutants. And so the Water Division turned to me for that as well. But at one point, only late. Part of the Water Division proposed for the Pine Barrens a weakening of the surface water quality standards, to allow a degradation of the quality in the open streams, the Batstow River and some of the others. They were looking at it from their perspective, which was tunnel vision, and were, I'll say, oblivious to the broader drive from the governor's office to protect the Pine Barrens as a whole, including its waters. Not only its waters, but including its waters. And we caught this in the commissioner's office, but only after the weakening had been proposed by the Water Bureau. And we stopped it, and we said, well, we're going to withdraw that proposal, and instead we're going to put in one that will tighten the water quality standards. So to make this story short, at one point I went down to a public meeting in Burlington County organized by the freeholders who were against preserving the Pine Barrens by and large, and important local politicians, to explain this change. And one of the famous local politicians who was opposing it, when I got up in front of the audience, complete with the press, and say, well, I have to tell you, we made a mistake. We want to protect the Pine Barrens. We want to protect the water quality. We put out this proposal that was going to weaken the water quality. That was wrong. We were wrong, and we're going to change it. And the politician got up and said, Dr. Paulson, you're going to admit that DEP was wrong? And I said, yes, we were, and we're going to fix it. He was hoping very much to score a political point at that. If DEP is wrong on this, aren't they wrong on everything else? And it turns out, I guess it was because of my style of explanation, when the papers came out the next day in the news coverage, it was DEP official comes to present the governor's plans to protect the Pine Barrens, admits a mistake, and is correcting it. And so the whole issue just went away. I mean, it does show that you have to have good communications within an agency if you're mounting on some major initiative like this, that you want to make sure that all your other moving parts are moving in the same direction.
And of course, the Pinelands was particularly a problem in this sense because Brendan Byrne was really the prime motivator, even against key advisors in his own office, and I assume in the department, that this was not an initiative that should be at the top of the priority list.
Well, I don't know about the discussions within the top level of the administration, but within DEP, we were all in favor of it. I mean, I wasn't in charge of the Parks and Wildlife Group. I know they were in favor of it, though. From the point of view of water supply, remember I had my hands in the water supply master plan. I knew the potential future importance of the Pine Barrens as a water supply for the state, and I knew that that importance would go away under any kind of major development scenario I can see. One of the quickest way to ruin an aquifer in an area like that is to have a lot of private homes with septic tanks. The septic tank outfall will just do in the water quality, and that's not something you can fix. You can deal with industrial chemicals more readily than you can fix the effluent from a septic tank overflow. And if you had them all over the place, the water supply option would quickly be degraded. So I was in favor of protection. The rest of the water group certainly was in favor of it. I doubt that there was a single naysayer in DEP about the drive to protect the Pine Barrens.
Within the department, as the governor's popularity declines largely because of the income tax, what was your feeling in terms of the future and his reelection and the prospects for a possible second term?
The broader issue of the income tax, of course, was far beyond the scope of DEP. All I was a resident of New Jersey in that regard, and I paying what taxes I was used to paying and then contemplating paying an income tax. I thought on the merits it was the right thing to do, to introduce an income tax. I had mostly lived as an adult in states that had income taxes, and so it was not a strange, novel idea to me. In terms of his overall popularity, at least my perception was that he had let us do the right things on the environment, on environmental health issues. The Tox Island Dam decision was behind us already, and I thought was the correct decision. I can't remember the timing of the Pine Barrens. I think that effort was launched already. The state spill fund was in place. We were dealing with closing wells, providing water supply, cleaning up. So I thought we had done a very credible job on his behalf on the issues that the department was responsible for. The Green Acres program had grown nicely under him, not my part of the department, but it had done well. And so we hoped that we would be not the source of bad news, in effect, but for those who were concerned with the environment of the state and what had been happening to it and with it, overwhelmingly positive, I think, overall, that would help. Other than that, we had, at least at my level, which was a political appointee, I was never asked to contribute, to go to a fundraiser or anything like that at all, which surprised me.
Talk a little bit about the people you worked with. You've mentioned a few of them already. Why don't we start with David Bardeen, who hired you?
Yeah. But David Bardeen, a lawyer, a very brilliant man, had a strong background in energy. He had been a top lawyer with the Federal Power Commission earlier in his career, and so he understood the energy industry very well. I think that was a big help in that a lot of the issues that we dealt with, including some that we haven't talked about this afternoon, expansions of refineries, proposed new natural gas pipelines, a proposed liquid natural gas terminal in the southern part of the state, a proposed deep water port, etc., all had an energy dimension. He was very demanding. He was an integrator. One thing I think I learned from him was this need to keep abreast of all the moving parts. He was the one who sent me down to that meeting in Burlington County to confess the department's mistake on the water quality thing, and I've often thought that was a very conscious decision to have me go down and say the department made a mistake, take whatever heat there was, and correct the mistake. It was kind of part of my training, as it were. I hadn't had to do anything like that before. He was a workaholic, as was I, and we were often the last two to leave. My office was right in his suite of offices most of the time. We were often the last two to leave at night. And occasionally we had a chance to work well into the evening on a proposed regulation on one of the issues that was my responsibility, proposed legislation, the Spill Compensation Control Act, for example. Many could not stand easily his demanding nature. And so some people that had been with the department for a long time left fairly early in his tenure, and others arranged to get assigned to positions where they didn't have to deal with the commissioner very often, if at all.
You also mentioned Rocco Rickey, who succeeded David Bardeen.
Yes. Rocco, fellow technical guy, I mentioned his background from EPA. Although I knew a number of people at EPA's New York office and had for many years, he and I had just by chance not met before. We got along extremely well. Probably Rocco is very easy to get along with in any event. He was demanding in his own way, but in a more gentle mode than was David Bardeen. I think because he was trained as an engineer, I was trained as a scientist, we had a common jargon together. We had discretely different responsibilities within the department, although on the toxic chemical side they did overlap significantly. On the water supply side, Rocco was the main person on the water supply master plan. I was a junior to him in that regard, although I guess I would say I was number two on that particular project. A delight to work with. Very skilled and knowledgeable about making the federal system work, particularly in providing money for sewage systems and sewage treatment plants. That's what he was brought in for. He was a master at that. And because he knew that field so well, he was able to deal very effectively with the sewage authorities of the state. Many of them, the leaders, were politicians rather than technical. Rocco had a way of bringing out the best in them, getting them not to be politicians, not to think about the jobs and the construction contracts and that, but to think about the needs, including the economic development opportunities that would come from expanding sewage treatment options into areas which didn't have them.
Anyone else that you particularly recall?
Well, there were a number. Yeah, there were a number. Betty Wilson, former state assemblyman, was with the department for a number of years and became acting commissioner for a while. Betty's background was not in any of the traditional environmental disciplines, but she quickly picked it up. Certainly her instincts were good. She played a significant role in the Pine Barrens issue and still does today as chair of the Pinelands Commission. That was probably her most visible contribution to the outside. In deliberations within the commissioner's office about tough choices, do we go this way, that way, do we propose the standard this way, do we wait on this, do we push ahead on that? She was not only a voice of political intelligence, but her instincts were always good. what's the best thing for people, what's the right thing to do for the environment.
Why don't we talk about your next career paths and the decision to move on from state government to other areas?
As I think I mentioned, I was there for most of the 2 terms. Toward the end of the 2nd term, we had a fairly frequent turnover of commissioners in the latter years of the Brendan term, acting and short term, so and so on. And at one point, I was at least a candidate to become the commissioner or acting commissioner for a while. This was in the last year of the governor's term. And someone else was chosen to take on that. And I knew, having learned a lot about the dynamics of government in these preceding 6 or 7 years, that it would not be likely that as a political, although I was there as a scientist primarily, that as a political appointee I would be kept by the next administration, no matter who won. So I had begun to think about next opportunities with about a year to go. Somewhat out of the blue, at the same time that the commissionership was given to someone else, I received a call from a headhunter who was representing the National Audubon Society, which had just hired a new president, Russell Peterson, who formerly had been governor of Delaware, and before that a DuPont executive, a chemist like me, who was looking for a new vice president for the Audubon Society that knew maybe something about birds. I didn't, but knew a lot about energy conservation, pesticides, that was my PhD, toxic pollution in the environment. The Superfund bill federal Superfund bill had not yet been passed at that time, and who had management ability. Well, I'd been managing several hundred people and some tens of millions of dollars. I didn't know anything about birds to speak of, but my official PhD was ecology, after all. And Peterson had been the chairman of the 3 Mile Island Commission appointed by President Clinton, and I knew as much about the 3 Mile Island accident as anybody else who was downwind. So I accepted the headhunter's invitation to go and meet Peterson in the Audubon offices in New York City. We hit it off, and he made me the proverbial offer I couldn't refuse, which included setting up a brand new group to deal with all those things I just said, and human population control, an issue that I've been concerned about for a long time but had never worked on. Plus, it had the advantages of supervising the traditional ornithological research, so I would learn something about birds on the job. The ecological research group, which did research to help Audubon manage its wildlife sanctuaries, and also the sanctuaries themselves. I hadn't done any parks or recreation work at DEP, but I'd certainly visited them. And the idea of suddenly managing 250,000 acres of land with endangered species on it and 2 million acres of water, along with all the other things I knew how to do, and facing the prospect of field trips to wildlife sanctuaries instead of to Superfund sites, seemed like a very attractive thing. So I said yes to that job offer and left within, I think, actually I stayed a few weeks to bring the Chemical Control Corporation facility to something that I thought was a more stable condition than eventually it turned out to be, but at least I'd gotten all the radioisotopes and things like that out. And I did that for a number of years. Wonderful field trips, a wonderful staff, very, very enjoyable, lots of travel to neat places instead of ugly places. We did pass the Superfund bill while I was at Audubon. And my role in that was sufficiently prominent, both from the New Jersey days and subsequently that I was actually at the White House signing ceremony. Congressman Florio, who was extremely instrumental in passing the bill, invited me to join him at the White House, which I considered a distinct honor. It's the only time I've ever been there. The Superfund bill was not well implemented by the Reagan administration. In fact, some watching this may remember that the person chosen by the Reagan team to run the Superfund program was eventually indicted for contempt of Congress, and the administrator of EPA hired to implement the Superfund program and everything else at EPA was forced out of office because of the terrible implementation of the Superfund program in large part. The chemical industry felt the heat of the non-implementation of the federal Superfund program. And a number of CEOs of the chemical industry decided they needed to do something at least regarding their part of the problem. And they approached Peterson, who remember was a DuPont executive earlier in his career, to see if he, Peterson, could find some national environmental groups that would help the chemical industry form a brand new nonprofit that would show how to clean up sites, since EPA wasn't doing it and wasn't forcing anybody to do it. And they designed something that eventually became called Clean Sites Incorporated, that was based in Washington and funded in large part originally by the chemical industry to help the chemical industry clean up sites where it was the dominant polluter. And that group needed they found a president, they needed some vice presidents, they needed somebody who had cleaned up a bunch of sites, and preferably they needed somebody who had some credentials in the environmental community as opposed to the industry. Well, it was kind of a logical thing for me. And so I was offered a position of vice president, going back into the Superfund business basically, at what amounted to an industry type salary as opposed to a nonprofit organization type salary, at the same time that the two stepchildren that I had acquired along the way were about to go to college. So financially it made sense for me to do that. So I moved to Washington, cleaned up another 25 sites. I'd done about 75 at DEP, including some other big famous ones around the country, and helped pioneer with that organization a way to get the polluters organized to share the costs. That was a big issue. To do the studies, to define what needed to be done, and then to select reputable contractors to do the work, all under the better EPA regime. And that was gratifying. The field trips weren't so nice as at Audubon, but that was gratifying. And then I was invited to join the Illinois Institute of Technology to head a new hazardous waste research center, which they were setting up, which was going to try to find new technologies to apply to Superfund sites. And I certainly had gotten tired of using the same old technologies for the previous 10, 15 years and thought I could make a contribution in a research mode, better, cheaper, faster kind of things. In addition, there was going to be a leadership change at Clean Sites, and I wasn't sure that the new leader there was somebody that I would be compatible with. So I moved to Chicago for several years and ran that program. We developed one neat microwave technology that actually works quite nicely on industrial pollutants in soils. That was the big technical success. We did some other things too, but that was the seminal accomplishment there. And then the leadership of the university changed hands, and I wasn't sure I was going to be able to work with the new leadership there as well. Plus, I developed some consulting activities. As a professor, you're allowed to do that, which were never a dull moment, you know, something new every month. And so I resigned from the full-time position at the university, kept a part-time appointment, and became a consultant. Still mostly in the Superfund realm, to some extent radioactive waste issues, to some extent industrial process issues, reducing the hazardous waste at the start so that you have fewer to deal with from the company level. And did that, I think, quite effectively for 10 years with with a diverse set of clients, many of which are still confidential, but they included a lot of insurance companies, a lot of manufacturing concerns, several federal agencies, and some state government agencies. Expert witness work, helping people do things right or fix things that were wrong, basically. And then, in the course of that, we did well enough that we built a home south of Jackson Hole, where we eventually moved full-time. And then, to bring it right up to date, my wife's daughter got married and grandchildren arrived in New York. And my wife's parents, who moved between Bergen County, New Jersey, and Florida over that 15-year period, roughly, are now up in years with some health problems. So it made sense to relocate to the East Coast, at least for a period of time. So we did that about 5 years ago. By happy coincidence, the School of Public Health at the University of Medicine and Dentistry was looking for an associate dean for research. When I was in New Jersey, I became acquainted with many of the researchers at Rutgers and at UMDNJ. Many of them are still there. I was a known quantity and had this diverse background, including some fundraising experience with foundations and so on, that looked helpful to the school. So for both the good and the bad family reasons and the challenge to do something new, you may have noticed I do get bored after about 5-6 years. I'm now back as a professor.
You mentioned your wife, who's also sat for one of these interviews. Why don't you describe briefly your meeting and relationship, at least since this is Valentine's Day?
Yes, of course. Linda Cooper, who has been with you before, was a prominent figure in the first burn campaign as a scheduler and one of the inner circle. She actually joined the administration before I did, because in the first weeks of his office, the first Arab oil embargo occurred, and he turned to a small number of trusted aides from the campaign to figure out what to do about the gas lines and making sure that energy supplies were available for hospitals and ambulance companies and fire companies and things like that. And so he enticed her, she'd been a volunteer for the campaign, enticed her to into the administration to set up, along with 2 others, the first energy office that invented the odd-even license plate gas line solution, among other things. She then stayed with the energy office for several years, developed a state energy plan for the governor, with a small team involving people from Princeton and 2 or 3 people from the administration. That was, I think, the first comprehensive state energy plan in the aftermath of the first Arab oil embargo, actually. Reliance on supply questions, energy conservation where it was feasible, and so on and so forth. David Bardeen actually tried to hire her away from another state agency, and so did I, for another job. She said no to him for the job. She said no to me for the job, but then she said yes later for other, more personal matters.
Glenn, before we close, any final thoughts about Brendan Byrne or about those days, or looking on the environment in large terms?
Well, those years, the 70s, were of course in the immediate aftermath of Earth Day, where the public perception of problems and the public desire for solutions was at its peak. It's still there, but it's kind of declined. Maybe global warming will bring it to a peak again, but certainly that was the decade. So there were major initiatives at the federal level. The Occupational Safety and Health Act passed, National Environmental Policy Act passed, major improvements in the Clean Air Act, the 1972 Water Pollution Control Act, the Hazardous Waste Bill known as RCRA, and the Superfund Bill. All were clustered in the first few years. In New Jersey, we started first. I mean, Brendan let us and led us to pass a hazardous waste regulatory bill several years before Congress, a state Superfund bill several years before Congress, regulations on toxic air pollutants, trace chemicals in the air, several years before EPA regs nationally. Water supply. I'm pretty sure the state water supply master plan that we did was the first one for a state as diverse as New Jersey. Industry, natural areas, agriculture important, etc. Some of the western states had done it, but it's ranching, maybe some mineral work, not the kind of industrial and heavy population potable water supply problems that we have here. I'm pretty sure that was the case. The Tox Island Dam issue set the stage. I mentioned the consulting company that's turned that into a line of business. I had another major water project when I was at Audubon in the Dakotas, which was going to have massive environmental consequences, move fish from the U.S. to Canada, where those fish don't exist in Canada, and threaten the fishing industry of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. I learned how to think about water projects on the job because of Tox Island. The governor took the bad news when we were doing things to protect human health. He was very conscious about that. I've seen a lot of governors in a lot of states take a different approach. They hide things, they delay things, they don't value health protection as much. We often use the phrase benign neglect for the governor's office. I think we were the recipients of benign neglect when we were doing things right. And if we screwed up, we heard about it. The water quality standards in the Pine Barrens, for example. I certainly learned how to manage large numbers of people and large amounts of money. I had a few people and a few $100,000 when I was at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Here I had hundreds of people and tens of millions of dollars. And back in those days, $1 million was a lot of money. So I developed management skills, probably some public communication skills, certainly knowledge of issues that I didn't know about, how to work in a context of laws, rules, and to some extent practical politics that I don't know, and under a leader whose instincts were great. As you know, Don, many of the people in his administration get together once a year, the holidays, with the governor to compare notes, stay up to date. And when you're at those events, invariably, even when the governor's not listening, people point out it was one of the highlights of their lives to serve in his administration. You could do what you knew how to do. You could do it for the benefit of the people of New Jersey. In the environmental sense, you could do it to benefit the environment of New Jersey. You could take the long look, as we did on Tox Island Dam, on the Water Supply Master Plan, on protecting the Pine Barrens. That's very rare, I think, for anybody who is involved in public life in whole or for a part of their career.
Thank you.
Thank you.